All right, I think we'll get started. So good morning and welcome to this panel. The topic is credentials. So we're going to be talking about all things credentials. What are credentials? How are they changing? What are the dynamics driving them? How are they broken? How do we need to improve them? So all sorts of dynamics related to credentials, both academic credentials, professional credentials, personal credentials, and some of the new kinds of credentials like badges and others. So hopefully you're here because you're passionate about credentials. And that matters because we're going to be a panel, and everybody up here is working in the world of credentials, has thought about it, has a background. But just mathematically, I'm guessing there's more intelligence on the topic in this bigger room than there is necessarily up here. So we want to make sure that this is also a discussion. In fact, we were given 2 pieces of feedback on how to moderate the panel. One was, apparently the feedback last year was don't do introductions. And the other one was limit the amount of Q&A, because both of them could potentially go off track and consume lots of time. So I thought it would be great in the spirit of data-driven decision-making if we started with introductions and we are going to end with Q&A. So going to stick with conventional forms because this is an education conference. So with that, let me briefly introduce myself. And then I'm going to ask, starting with you, Michael, kind of going from my left to right, for each panelist, introduce yourselves, just obviously name, organization, and the part of credentialing that you intersect with. And then I'm sure what our organizations do will sort of be emergent as we go through the panel. And then by way of my own introduction, I'm Matt Patinsky, CEO of an Arizona-based company. So thank you for stimulating our local economy, called Parchment. And we are in the credentialing world, mainly around transcripts. And with that, let me ask you to introduce yourself.
Michael Krosno. I'm with MyEDU Corporation, and we're in the credentialing world because we have a credentialing platform that sits between the academic skills and the job and employer requirements.
I'm Kate Kazin. I'm the Chief Academic Officer of College for America at Southern New Hampshire University. We do give degrees, which I think are a form of credential, but we're looking at micro-credentials and other ways to help students in a competency-based system let employers and others know what they know and what they can do.
I'm Mark Johnson with Pearson. There's the K-12 part of Pearson, the higher ed part of Pearson, and then the professional career. And I work as a bridge between the higher ed and professional career businesses, looking at credentials, badges, and other types of achievements.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sunny Lee, and I work for Mozilla for Open Badges. Basically, what Open Badges is trying to do is there are lots of different recognition systems out there, credentialing models out there, but a lot of them are siloed off. So we want to promote a standard for all these different recognition systems, badge systems, to start communicating in a common language through this technical standard.
Great. So we obviously have a great panel up here. So what I thought I would do is the questions are organized into 3 basic buckets. The first is sort of setting the stage. Then we'll move into sort of problems and dynamics, and then we'll talk about the path forward. And if that actually happens, that will be a remarkable achievement. So let's start by setting the stage. I know this sounds like a very elementary question, but it's interesting how many people have very different definitions. So I want to start with, what is a credential? And we've had a little bit of email exchange before, so I'm going to pick on Mark to kind of take the first shot at that, and then others can build on the answer. But what is a credential? What do we mean by credentials?
Yeah, it is a good question, and I think there is confusion because it has really 2 distinct definitions. One is it's your qualifications, it's your preparation that makes you suitable for something. And the second definition is it's the certificate, it's the piece of paper that people often talk about, right? Suitable for framing, here is your credential. And so the world is changing very quickly, and now we're looking at, I think, both of those definitions as evolving. You know, one is that your suitability for a particular effort, job, whatever, is now perhaps leaning a little more towards competency than education, formal education. And then the second definition is changing because we're in a digital world, and so the paper certificate is now really becoming obsolete because there are digital credentials that you can deliver that would have verification, security, and deeper insight into what the credential actually means.
Anyone like to build on that?
Yeah,
definition?
I'd like to add that I think traditionally there's been the idea that the credential is bestowed by a third party and that is meaningful to a third party. And I think that's part of the definition that's also being shaken up by badges which people can give to each other. Not that people aren't third parties, but this notion that there's a warrantor or somebody who is saying this is meaningful. And I think that goes beyond, the changes in that area are going beyond even how you deliver it or how you store it or how you transmit it.
I also, oh,
Go ahead.
really quickly, when I think about credentials, I do think a little bit more formal educational channels, but I do feel like we're finding a lot of models of credentialing that are happening that are more complementary beyond the formal educational channel. So I do feel like credential, the definition has been expanding with increased learning opportunities beyond formal.
See, and from our perspective, I think the credential and the definition is today what it is, and tomorrow it'll be completely different. And I think what it'll be is what employers are defining it as. I think this movement in credentials is a function of employers overinflating degrees for many, many years. And now they're starting to say, you know what, I need to break this down into a set of skills that are validated, that, you know, match my job with that individual. That's what's creating the definition of a credential. And the credentials are going to be defined by them as soon as technology gives them a better opportunity to do it. Whether it's a badge, a certificate, a skill, whether it's a course you took, whether it's a project you have, or, you know, a mission trip you went on. Those are what are credentials.
So if I took my notes well, you're saying the current state of credentialing, sort of three factors. It has something to do with the kind of institution that's issuing it. It has something to do with the symbolic form of it, the paper, the certificate, and then it has something to do with the content, the thing that it's representing. So are reputation scores credentials, and why not?
I mean, so once again, I'll go back to the definition for me. I think it's a good question. You know, reputation scores can be to certain jobs, and therefore they're a credential given for that specific job. And I don't think credentials are going to get looked upon, you know, at a real broad basis. I think they're really going to get very narrow, and they're going to get very skills focused. And if somebody wants a reputation score, you know, based upon how many tweets you may have or something.
So your prediction is the next generation, to quote Forrest Gump, the next generation of credentials are what credentials do.
Yeah.
And if something is a piece of information that reasonably predicts well skills and competencies, then it is a credential. So credentials are signals.
I mean, that's, to me, they're signals. Right.
Okay. So, Sunny, given those definitions, and you kind of began to do this, and this is a little bit of a setup of all the folks, you know, people know MyEDU, they know Pearson, they're going to get to know New England. I would love for you to just give a sense. Do you see badges, which is so, you know, talked about so frequently? Do you see badges as credentials? Is that what you're trying to do? And I think to answer that, you do need to give a quick primer on what badges are.
Sure. I think a lot of people, when we say badges, easily conjure up images of scouting badges, and those are definitely badges. But we also feel like when we say badges, it's basically simply something that visually represents a variety of things, including your interests, affiliations, skills, competencies. So when we say badges at Mozilla, we're using kind of the broader definition of badges. That includes meatier badges like certifications, all the way to more smaller, granular badges as well. A lot of people have been saying that badges are micro-credentials. We don't necessarily think, I don't necessarily think that badges have to just be limited to micro-credentials. I think badges can be a credential. I think they can be complementary to existing formal, narrow definition of credentials. I do feel like badges is pushing the envelope and helping expand the definition of how people perceive credentials today.
Any other thoughts on badges?
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that. What Sunny and her team are building, you know, although it has this name of badges, we think it's really cool because they have really created the interoperability data standard for achievements of all types, right? Degrees, potentially. I mean, so you could, in a sense, badge a degree, a graduate degree, and represent that through this data standard. And I think that's key because it's going to unlock the portability of these achievements, right? Credentials, badges, they're becoming, blurry and synonymous. But the badging should also be considered as a technology that enables the movement of these credentials and the sharing of them.
So it's kind of interesting that your different definitions, so I'm going to get a little bit academic, because why not? So if you read the social science literature on credentials, there's sort of three conceptions of what credentials are and how they work and why they do what they do. And I think all three kind of came up here. One is credentials are measures. You can't put a thermometer in someone's brain and kind of measure their skills and training, so credentials are the best next way of representing the skills and training and competencies someone has. And that's kind of the rational way that we think about credentials. On the polar opposite scale, sort of critical sociology, would say that credentials are really just currency. You mentioned credential inflation. Credentials are only as valuable as supply and demand. And so once upon a time, it was sufficient to have a high school credential because few people did. And now college credentials are the baseline, not because really things have gotten that much more complex. A firefighter doesn't need a college degree to be a firefighter, but it's related to status and the currency of that. And that suggests kind of an ever-chasing escalation until you need a PhD to be a janitor. And I think that's somewhat what employers are responding to. And then the third conception of credentials, which is sort of somewhere in the middle, is that they're signals. They may actually signal competencies, they may not. The New York Times had the example of a law firm in Atlanta that requires a college degree for clerk because it suggests something about someone's goal aspirations. And obviously, to get $120,000 in debt to signal goal aspirations, one would hope there are other signals than that. So there are those three conceptions. Which one, and I'm kind of interested in each of your answers, and pieces of that came out in the different, which one do you think best characterizes kind of the way credentials work today, and which one do you think is most likely to be emergent over time? Is it a measure? Is it a currency, or is it a signal?
Yeah, so the way it is today, credential to me is basically defined as a degree in some form of, is it a 2-year degree, a 1-year certificate? So we put about 4 or 5 different categories on that. And I think where it gets into tomorrow is much more of a validated skill, a validated signal, less so a measurement. I'm not a big, I don't see employers right now looking to measure the depth of someone's, skill. I think they're still going to do that in more face-to-face interviews. But I think it's a way of being able to, from our perspective and what we see, it's a way of getting things from the top of a funnel down to the bottom of a funnel. And is that person qualified to generate a job and to do what they want? And so I don't think it's that elaborate. I don't.
So let's stop there. So it's a signal you don't see, even though you believe in competency-based education, you don't necessarily think that a credential itself is going to fully communicate that. It's going to be a person. Does anyone disagree with that? That's actually a little bit of a counter, not cultural, but a counter-orthodoxy, unorthodox view. Does anyone disagree with that and believes we are going to get, someone like a Degreed is literally trying to create the kind of clout score that really summarizes, like a FICA report, skills and capabilities from all sorts of inputs?
Let me just add one thing. The average, person looking at a job right now spends 7 to 10 seconds scanning the top of a funnel of a resume. Yeah. That's it. Talk to anybody. So so to me, it's, hey, how do you represent those skills?
Well, I'll disagree a little bit, but not more of a disagreement, but maybe perhaps an add-on. I think measurement is really important, and I think that we're evolving to where measurement can actually be part of the credential in a way that it really hasn't had the opportunity to this point. To Michael's point, an employer only has so much time to scan, but hopefully the market evolves to where as you scan, you see something and you can assess its relative merit against other things that you scan, right? So a score in critical thinking skills, which you can test for, I think that would be interesting, on a resume of the future to see, this is a higher level score than a lower level score.
Just one thing. We did an interesting test. So here's a good example of scoring and measurement. So we went to a bunch of employers and we said, how important is a grade point average in a course? And they said, oh, it's really important. And I said, well, it'd be interesting, if we could show you that somebody got to be in a course, but we could show you the great distribution of everybody else in that course, then how do you look at that B? And it was just fascinating when you put up a course and you say, hey, the average grade distribution in this particular chemistry course was a 3.7, and this person got a 3.4. 1 minute ago, you loved that 3.4, now you see more. You have to put a lot of data up to put measurements to be valid to an employer. You really do. So I believe validation is critical. I think measurement is relative and very, very hard.
It's interesting, in our conversations with employers, we ask them, why do you collect transcripts? And when candidates go through the evaluation process, it's often self-reported. And when you actually, they didn't articulate it this way, but when you actually boil it down, it's a veracity test. It's not actually the content of the GPA, because by then they've decided to hire the person. They don't just want a way of checking the accuracy of what was self-reported, simply to know that candidates tell the truth. So it's a veracity.
So I hate to say
So
this.
what's your conception? Where do you
Well,
see in
I
those
just
three?
want to say one thing about the transcript, which is that it's a black box. I mean, it tells you absolutely nothing about what somebody knows and can do. And so I think part of the reason why it ends up being a veracity test, if it's looked at all, is because it's not particularly meaningful, except in the context of somebody from exactly that same school, who took exactly the same courses and, who you can compare. But, part of the reason why I think competency-based education is so important is that it does, go away from this sort of world of relative measurements to one in which you can actually have claims about what somebody knows and can do, and you can have confidence that they actually know and can do those things. So I think that's part of it. The second point I guess I'd make is we can certainly look at the credentialing issue in terms of, what's the problem, right? And I think part of the problem is that employers don't have information about their employees, which is why they end up making split-second decisions. And prospective employees don't have ways to signal, in the somewhat cynical term you used, or to indicate in some way that's helpful what they know and can do. So there's really a mismatch, and I think credentials sort of grow up as proxies for that information that people are craving, but they're not very good proxies, so we keep slicing and dicing them or adding additional ones and so on.
I do agree that employers don't have enough information and are reliant on the degree indicated on the resume so that they can easily scan it. But I think it's become kind of a easy shorthand crutch that they like to do. Like they just scan through it, see what they want to see, a Bachelor of Arts degree from a great higher ed institution, and then move on, like give that person an interview. I'm not saying that, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I do feel like in that process, people have become totally dependent and reliant on that shorthand.
Oh, absolutely.
I wish I had mentioned to you that my company does transcripts. So we've shifted into the problem, and I think we've done a decent job of laying out the problem from the employer's perspective. I think there are good differences of opinion about the nature of the solution. They may rationally say, what I want is to go deeper, competency, get into those skills. I think what I'm hearing you say is there's just the ergonomics of reviewing people, and it's still always going to come down to certain sorting and signaling type of functions. You can never get that authentic. And then there's alternative perspectives, which is, and obviously Pearson's a global expert on assessment, that no, there actually are ways of getting tractable representations of skills and competencies that could allow for that kind of ergonomics. I want to ask a tougher question, because I think this has to be answered for change, is what's the problem for the credential issuer? For the high school, for the college, for Stack Overflow, which Sunny uses as an example often, because if we don't understand, if the issuers in their own enlightened self-interest don't understand the changing nature of credentials, then we've got some challenges creating change. So does anyone think they could articulate the problem from the perspective of the sender, the issuer? And I kind of want to put Kate a little bit on the spot.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're a good example to put on the spot. So, Sunny talked about the, BA from the good university, and that's really not the problem, right? The problem is all these students who may or may not be well-equipped to work at companies, but don't really have ways of indicating that, because so much is about brand recognition and so on. So it's all about credibility. I mean, I think that's the other part of credential is credibility. And, there have to be ways beyond, good marketing and self-promotion, not that there's anything wrong with that, to sort of for the issuer to signal credibility and that there is value in that credential.
Yeah, and when an issuer signals, I see two sides of it. So one of the things that's interesting to me, and you could probably comment a lot more, is the reason competencies, and by the way, competencies and credentials are being used interchangeably. The reason why systems like Wisconsin, and you guys are doing a lot more in competency, why Capella calls themselves a competency school right now, is because degrees have become so expensive. It's a way still to drive revenues in many, many cases and get people to come in and take fewer courses and still pay. So the driver behind this competency initiative is not so altruistic that we're really trying to do this to help these kids just get better jobs. So let's put that on the table, number one. And number two, when you start going to a competency or skills-based model of telling your story, it's much more complex. You can't do that on a resume. So there's this whole industry centered around digital resumes. We have our system. Everybody has different systems doing this. And until that technology really gets sophisticated where people can customize different stories for different jobs with different tile systems, we're a long ways away if I'm helping that issuer really tell that story efficiently.
But I thought your earlier comment was that the inherent challenge of that is on the receiving or employer side.
It's on both sides.
They
It's on
need to
both
work
sides.
at a scale with an efficiency that level of work makes
Well,
challenging.
I mean, the
except
ideal
for select.
situation is you have a student being able to tell their story, you have an employer being able to share, set their requirements, and the best fit brings them together. So, you've got two things on each end, which with a model that, is kind of Amazon-ish, which is, hey, where's that best fit come? And that's still a journey.
So Cindy, why are people issuing badges? What problem is it solving for them?
So I do want to point out that what we're talking about is, in fact, credential, the signal, the currency. But what it's signaling is the learning and the assessment and the learner's capability. And I think the issuer still needs. We shouldn't forget about that. Like there's still. The issuer still has to come up, or the institution that is issuing these credentials still needs to think hard about the type of learning content that they're providing, the type of assessment that they're providing. Like that's important. That's the most important thing. Whether it's a micro-credential, a badge, or a credential, these are ways in which we can help learners better capture the learning that they're undertaking so that they can better communicate it out to stakeholders. But I don't want us to undermine the importance of the learning that's taking place. That's what's going to uphold the currency of the credential that is issued as a result.
So we're going to segue into more of an open discussion because I see a lot of familiar faces that are certainly smarter than me on this topic. Let me just ask a final question, which is, I don't feel like I've heard anything new in the sense that these are new problems. I mean, I heard new insights. That came out the wrong way. But there's nothing new in this problem. I mean, I think we could have said this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So, and yet there's so much attention being spent on credentialing, the changing nature of credentials, new forms of credentials, Mozilla launching the Badges Project. So what is it about now that this issue, and it sounds like Kate wants to lead off, what is it about now that these long-standing failures in our credentialing system are so salient and getting so much attention?
Well, I think there are at least two things. I'm sure there are many more, but one is really the crisis of higher education. And I think leaving aside the leafy campus we tend to memorialize and refer to in terms of our experience, I think there's a growing recognition on the part of students, of employers, of parents, everybody involved in the ecosystem that it's a broken mess in many ways. So I think there is definitely a hunger for ways that are don't put people into hideous debt, that are less kind of crude. The 4-year degree, which is really the 6-year degree if you're lucky, is a really kind of crude proxy, right? So I think there's a hunger for kind of more specific, more tailored, more customized, more relevant information. I think that's one piece. And I think that we live in a world in which people are also hungry to talk about themselves. And, you know, if people can, you know, I was just reading something on, I don't know, Slate about the kinds of things new mothers tend to want to, and fathers want to talk about their babies doing or having produced. There is a kind of self-credentialing ethos, I think, in which everybody's experience is enormously important to them. This is obviously somewhat cynical, but I think there is this world in which we all want to be, you know, noticed, important, and to communicate our, you know, our special expertise and experience to everyone. And I think there's kind of a weird collision of those two phenomena happening.
That's almost a cultural trend.
I think it is a
we're in
cultural trend, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add what Kate's saying. We were talking with General Motors recently, and they were fascinating because they had an interesting perspective. They said roughly there's 20 million college kids out there, and there's 60 million kids that have some college credits that can't, you know, that they can't find, they don't know how to access. And they look at it from the standpoint, if we can expand the breadth and the depth of the people that we try and recruit for jobs, just think how much better off we're going to be, both one as a society and two as an employer. And that's really what they're trying to get at with this competency and credentials business. I mean, they can get the credentials from those college kids. It's the growing supply and demand curve in this marketplace that's driving this whole initiative around credentials and competency. It's you know, it's kind of scary for kids that.
So would that suggest that it's credential inflation? We've reached the point where
I think
so many people have degrees, they don't work in the way that they used to work, and so new types of...
Well, that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it, there's a whole bunch of people without degrees that would really want better lives and better jobs, and that's how they try and get them. Okay. And they have to
Yeah.
compete with people with degrees, you know.
Yeah, agree and agree. And Matt, you know, you said something at the introduction that I think is another driver, like what's new now about this. And I think that you've got certain industries that are doing exactly what Michael and Kate are, you know, espousing, which is, you know, we're really second guessing this requirement that you have an AA or even a BA, you know, to come work at my organization. IT is leading the charge here, right? And so
Absolutely true.
it's a great example of an industry that says, look, if you're a 17-year-old hotshot programmer, right, and you kind of have an idea of what you're good at and your skills, you know, maybe this Cisco networking route, you know, get your certification, is a faster path, right? You don't get the debt. Sorry, I'm pointing at you, but no. But of a, you know, a formal education process, a degree program, and advanced manufacturing is right behind it. And I think that that is a game changer, right? I mean, we're talking about faster people and jobs. And at the end of the day, this is credentials make this process more efficient.
Just to quickly add to that, I think nowadays more than ever before, the ways in which learners learn are so much more vast. You don't necessarily have to go to a brick and mortar higher ed institution to learn the skills that you need to apply to become a kick-ass programmer, for instance. So when you apply for jobs, there's always been like, you know, a Bachelor of Science degree or equivalent experience. I think there's a lot more or equivalent opportunities happening, which is kind of bringing to bear questions about credentials in general. I mean, I can only speak for Mozilla, but when we're hiring programmers, the traditional computer science degree from a Stanford University, yeah, that's cool, but you know, what's more important is to know whether this guy actually knows how, this guy actually knows how to code or not, and to be able to represent that.
Great. So a lot of ideas in there, from just the growth and diversity of education service providers to what was discussed about sort of the uncredentialed and their value, or the partially credentialed, and being able to tap there. Interestingly, technology was not part of anyone's answers.
It was implicit.
What's that?
It was implicit.
To a certain extent, but culture, other factors. Okay, so there's long been an irony in education technology conferences that people speak for 45 minutes with PowerPoint about the evils of speaking in the classroom for 45 minutes with PowerPoint. And then someone pointed out for me this morning that in conferences we're talking about the flipped classroom, but we haven't flipped the conference. So we've just could have videotaped this, and everybody could have watched it, and then this time could have been used to engage each other. So this now is the most difficult part of being the moderator, is now let's try to really have that flipped session and bring people in and have a great discussion around the future and challenges of credentials. So right up here, and we've got the microphone.
Oh, great. Thank you. A few questions. One, there are certain things I think you can put online in credentialing. For example, there's a group called eLance or OData where I can say, to your point, Sonny, I'm looking for someone with these specific programming skills. I don't care if they're in New York, California, China, Ukraine. I just want to know you can do it. I want to know how much it's going to cost me. And I want to know you've done it before and what others have said about your work. And I find it very interesting in all the credentialing, the number one way we hire is usually through our network. And the badges are nice, but the first thing we look at is who do you know, who do you know, who have you worked with? Secondly, what are their credentials? Where did you go to school? Okay, you went to a good school, so check. And then thirdly, sort of the credentials, can you actually do it? That then gets you the interview. So I'm curious, where's the network review from the peers in the school, outside the school, that really connect that? I mean, one could argue Harvard and those places are nothing more than a very exclusive network that you're buying into, more than learning from. So could you touch on that aspect, the network part?
So anyone in the room should feel comfortable being part of the answer. Let's start up here in the panel. since it's easy.
I do feel like what we're trying to address are those folks that don't have those networks in place. Like, how can those people get their foot in the door? If they've gone through online courses or taken certification courses, but they don't have that network, how do those people get linked in? And I think we want to kind of think about those people a little bit more. And even if you're within a network, if you're changing jobs, then what's the best way to go about that? We feel like the current network system is the default, but we think that pool is limited, and we need to expand it to be more inclusive of all the other people out there.
So it's interesting, if you look at what LinkedIn did to answer that problem, they came up with this thing called endorsements. And so when you sit down and talk to an employer and you ask them, how much relevancy do you put on endorsements, it's very low. So what we ended up doing is we thought about doing that same thing, but our employer said that's not what we want. What we want you to do is to be able to validate in 3 different ways your skills. One is the projects, one are experiences, and one are the courses and the academics you took. Those are the 3 things. Now they said, can you bring in validation? So if you worked on a project with multiple people, can you bring in the network there? And so they want the network, but they don't want it in the form of an endorsement. And so it's a struggle. It's a great question. It's a struggle because you have to bring it in consistent with what the validation is.
Any responses in the room before we move to a new topic?
Sure. So I actually work at a large community college, and obviously certificates are like the new crack cocaine for the higher ed system. And there's credit and non-credit certificates, and we are very rigorous in our certificate offerings, but there are a lot of people out there. There's no standardization and no model for what is a good certificate or not. And so what we're finding is that, kind of one good hire leads to another good hire. And so employers are coming to us and intercepting these people before they're even finished with their certificate because we've somehow risen to the top of the stack. So I think there is what's the value of the institution, right? And what's the value of the network? And we're trying to figure out the way to improve that network because I think a lot of it is not online. I hate to say it, but I think it's a social network and it's a career network. And so we're starting to add, and I'm continuing ed, so I'm the non-credit side. We're trying to add how do you build your personal brand and how do you build your network kind of aspect into the offerings so that we're doing more than just giving them a C# certificate or a project management certificate. So I'm interested in that area.
So
On that real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry, please. So just to follow up on that, which I think is really interesting. For example, the state of Michigan started looking at their teachers' colleges, right? I think you guys know this better than I do, but I'm going to go out on a limb. And as they graduated and started getting those teachers into teaching positions in schools that then weren't producing good kids, they were starting to say, we as a state will revoke your credentials. And so it sounds a lot like what you're saying. You guys have risen to the top because the community is saying you've got great credentials. So maybe it's a feedback loop to say, and someone else's credentials stink.
Well, I love.
I think that worries me about badges.
Right. I love your question. I think there's a problem that, we've had for a long time that's been created by these institutions. And I don't want to be controversial here, but if you think about the way an employer connects with a student today, they do it through a career service center. You show me an industry anywhere that sticks a broker in the middle and doesn't allow those two people to connect unless it's going through the center. Talk to an employer, they can't stand it. And yet these institutions, all of them have done such, and I'm not down on a career service, there are value propositions. It is not sticking between the employer and the student. If you talk to a student, talk to an employer, the number one thing they want to do, they want to start tracking those students early. It's the number one thing, and the institutions don't allow it. Yes. So, perfect, let's work.
Anyone want to build on that?
Well, I just wanted to say something in support of community college certificates, because Tony Carnevale has done a lot of great work on actually how valuable these are, and that many people who have a certificate but not a BA can do much better than actually many BA holders. So his work on this is really terrific. And we've been talking as though all credentials were equivalent, and I think there are many distinctions to be made among certificates, certification, licensing, all of those are lumped in together. But I think the other thing is that I think for people of a certain age, and I'm certainly one of them, we tend to make distinctions between sort of real life, which has networks and communities, and then, that digital thing that happens online. And I think for people of perhaps a younger generation, or at least digital natives, that's really a very puzzling distinction to them. They really would not understand even the question. And at College for America, for instance, we're doing a lot to, although it's a completely online program, we're doing a lot to build networking skills and community among the students. So I think it's a bit of a false distinction.
So, and I think back there, but definitely Anthony Carnevale, his center at Georgetown, definitely must-read work if you're interested in credentials.
Hi, I'm Linda Fanton. I am the Director of Network Journalism and Innovation at American Public Media, so I'm a little fish out of water here. But, we've heard a lot of talk about skills and ability, but really the sort of title of this whole thing was about knowledge. So I'm just curious, because as a journalist for 20 plus years, one of the things that we always have to try to answer for the audience is, how does someone know what they know? So that often gets morphed. We haven't always done a great job of that. Credentials and attribution get shorthanded to so-and-so, author of this book, or so-and-so, PhD, professor of such and such. So I'm just curious, when you are interviewing or hiring, how are you discerning how people know what they know? And actually, are you asking that question so that the answer might be, well, I know about this because I actually lived it. I went through it. Or I know about this because I worked on a project once and it was something we had to tackle, and here's how we tackled it. So not just, credentials assess some things and skills and ability, but how are you actually assessing what people know and how they know what they know?
So Mark, do you want to take the first shot at that, just to balance out participation, and then I'm sure others want to chime in as well.
Great, you stuck me with the hard one.
No.
No, well,
Keeping tag of airtime.
It's a great question, and I'll go back a little bit to something I said earlier, which is, when you talk about the scannability of the resume and you're trying to assess, what someone knows and can do, right? Then you really need the shorthands that you talked about, but they have to be relative. I had an open position for a financial analyst, and there were some finalists, and the one that I felt like was the most promising said, "I'm a spreadsheet jockey." I'll never forget the term. So so we go through the process, we hire him, and turns out not the case. And so and shame on me, right? I didn't sit the candidate down in front of a computer and give him a quick assessment of, do these formulas, these macros, run this. Well, the ecosystem today is evolving where those are credentials that are out there, and you can basically assess someone's Microsoft Excel chops, and get a score on a relative index that basically says they're better than the next person that says, I'm a spreadsheet jockey. And so you're absolutely right in the point that, you know, the world is turning, the employment world is turning to what can you do, right? And I really love this. This is why it's an exciting place to be in right now, is because we are at this shift between the seat time-based achievement and the competency-based achievement. And so I think that, you know, things like College for America are so exciting, Southern New Hampshire University, that it's really moving that way. And anyway, that's
I
one way
also, just to add to Mark, I totally agree with you. I do feel like you have to be able to demonstrate it. You have to be able to link to or provide the evidence of your claim. And for for instance, in our work with Open Badges, I mentioned that what we're trying to do is define a technical standard of what a badge, what a certificate should look like. One of the key pieces of one of the metadata fields that is in there is an opportunity to link to the evidence associated with earning that badge. It's not a required field because there's obviously data implications, but we're strongly encouraging organizations who align their certificates, align their badge systems with our standards to really seriously consider that evidence URL.
Okay, right up here, please.
Hi, Edwin Eisendrath. I'm a managing director at the Huron Consulting Group. And I think what you're doing has such profound implications that I have to ask an inflammatory question. Hopefully I'll know the difference between a horse and a spreadsheet. But, let's say I hire people, but I hire people, and I don't hire skills. And each person I hire is a collection of skills, and I have to figure out which ones are relevant, how they work together, and there's some things that have nothing to do with skills, but fit and all kinds of other issues. But let's say I am the manager of a sports team, and there's some very specific physical attributes I need. Would you go so far as to say a chip that contains your DNA is a badge? I mean,
Is this the first time you've been asked this question?
because I'm talking about what defines a person in a relevant way for work.
Absolutely. I think, so we are not defining the content of the badge. That's up to anybody who is interested in badging and what's important to them. So if for a sports management team, if that becomes a relevant piece of information that they need to know in order to hire, then I can definitely conceivably see that those types of badges circulating. When we talk about badges, they're not limited to skills and competencies. We think we definitely know a learner, a job candidate is much more dimensional than the skills and competencies that they're able to do. There are also a lot of soft skills that they can represent, a lot of kind of social characteristics as well. And we're finding these types of soft skills are also being badged by organizations and being taken into consideration for candidate evaluation. So badges are not limited to skills and competencies by no means.
You know, I just want to make one interesting statement, Edwin, on that, and that is, you know, Halliburton recently came and we were sitting down asking them, you know, look, how would you rank the hiring? They hire roughly 600 petroleum engineers. They said the number one thing we want is we want to know that somebody worked outside during their summer months. That was it. And that was their first criteria. And so to me, it is a technology question. How does somebody personally brand themselves? I don't remember who brought that question up, but that's a big part of credentialing. How do you personally brand yourself? That's a technology discussion, you know, and they want to see people that worked on projects that were like painting fences. I went, really? And you're looking for petroleum engineers. No, we want people that paint fences. So it is a DNA thing, but it's technology.
All right, so let's take a final question up here.
Yeah, just I guess a pragmatic sort of view of the world. In an earlier life, I delivered about 20,000 a day transcripts and resumes to 170 different companies. And they were deluged with input, right? So the first pass filtering is not on a specific skill, at least 10 years ago. Today, one of the things that I think is going to be important is to get to a point where the receivers have the tools to be able to do that filtering that you're talking about earlier on rather than at the final stage of the funnel. So just a reflection that I think one of the areas of focus has to be on the employers to be able to deal with the input that you're talking about giving them. Just a comment.
Yeah. Great. Okay. We were told to end at 1:45. I think we have done that. Hopefully you've thought something different or learned something different about credentials. Enjoyed the conversation. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.